The idea no one saw coming. It started with a conversation that most people would have forgotten, a passing comment during a late-night meeting when Mark Zuckerberg sat at the edge of a long, polished table, staring out into the dark city beyond. The glass. His team was discussing new partnerships, new investments, the usual rhythms of a life built around billions of dollars and endless opportunities. But Mark's mind was somewhere else entirely. He listened without speaking, his fingers drumming lightly against the table, his thoughts spiraling around a question that had been haunting him for months. He had built a world where anyone could connect at the touch of a button. He had built systems, platforms, and communities that reached every corner of the globe. But lately, he had started to wonder if the digital bridges they created had made it too easy to forget the human faces on the other side. He wondered if wealth and status had built walls around him so high that he no longer understood the struggles of the everyday people he once promised to empower. That night, as the meeting ended and the room emptied, Mark stayed behind, lost in thought. He stared at the city, watching tiny figures move along the sidewalks far below, people rushing home, people sleeping under flickering streetlights, people whose stories he would never hear. And he made a decision so simple, so crazy, that it surprised even himself. He decided to disappear, not forever, not completely, just long enough to see the world through different eyes, to feel, if only for a few days, what it meant to be unseen, unheard, overlooked. He would strip away the name, the wealth, the power. He would become just another shadow on the streets, and he would start with something simple, visiting a local bank to ask for help, not as Mark Zuckerberg, billionaire, but as a man with no address, no job, no safety net. He wanted to see if kindness still existed in the corners of the world untouched by headlines and cameras. The next morning, before the sun had risen, Mark, dressed in worn jeans and a heavy coat that hung off his thin frame like a forgotten curtain. He rubbed dirt into his hands and face, practicing the movements of someone who had grown used to being invisible. He carried a small, battered backpack and nothing else. No phone, no wallet, no way to prove who he really was. He left his mansion quietly, slipping through the early mist like a ghost. He took a bus to a part of the city he rarely visited, a place where the buildings leaned into each other like old men sharing tired secrets, where the streets were cracked and the windows stared blankly into the morning fog. He found a corner near a small bank, not one of the sleek, modern skyscrapers he usually dealt with, but a modest neighborhood branch tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. He sat on a bench outside, feeling the weight of eyes that barely looked at him, the cautious glances, the wide steps people took to avoid him. He felt, for the first time in a long time, the heavy loneliness of being unseen. He waited until the bank opened. Then he stood, pulled his coat tighter around himself, and walked through the glass doors into a different world. The lobby was small and clean, the kind of place where fluorescent lights buzzed gently and the faint scent of old coffee clung to the air. A woman in a crisp blue uniform stood behind the counter, typing into a computer. Another banker, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, spoke quietly with a customer. No one looked at Mark as he entered. He approached the counter, clearing his throat. The woman looked up, her smile faltering slightly when she saw him. He saw the hesitation flicker across her face, quick, almost hidden but real. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but guarded. Mark nodded, shifting his backpack nervously. He had practiced the story in his mind all night. I need to open an account," he said. "I just started a new job. I don't have anything yet. No real address, but I need a place to put my first paycheck." The woman hesitated again, glancing at the manager across the room. Mark saw the silent communication pass between them, the raised eyebrows, the slight shake of the head. "I'm sorry, sir," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Without proper identification and proof of residence, we can't open an account for you." Mark nodded, pretending to accept it, but inside he felt a sharp pang. He had expected it, he had prepared for it. But it still hurt to be dismissed so easily, so politely. He tried again. He explained that he was working hard, trying to get back, on his feet. He offered to provide references from shelters he stayed at. He spoke about wanting to save, to build something, to not fall further into the cracks. But the walls stayed up, polite, professional, impenetrable. Mark thanked her quietly and turned to leave. He stepped back into the cold morning, the mist thick around him, and sat once again on the bench outside. He watched people come and go, their faces closed off, their steps quick. He wondered how many others had sat just like this, hoping for a chance, only to find the doors they needed most locked tight against them. He thought about what it meant to build a better world, and he realized with a slow and growing ache that the hardest part was not building the tools or the technology. It was remembering to see the people, really see them. Mark sat there for a long time, feeling the cold seep into his bones until the sky shifted from grey to the pale blue of a new afternoon. And just when he was about to give up and leave, something happened, something small, something that would change everything, because not everyone at the bank had looked away. And one act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would test not just the bank, but Mark's own understanding of hope, humanity, and what it truly meant to belong. The kindness that cracks the wall, the cold of the bench seemed to have seeped into Mark's very bones as he sat there, head bowed against the soft drizzle that had begun to fall. His hands, once used to gripping microphones and pens, now gripped the frayed straps of his battered backpack like a lifeline. He tried not to think about how easily the doors had closed against him inside the bank, about how polite rejection still stung when you were already standing on the outside looking in. He reminded himself that this was the reality for millions of people, not just a temporary disguise for him. But knowing that did not make the loneliness feel any less real. Inside the bank, beyond the glass doors, a young woman named Emily watched him. She was not a manager, not a decision-maker, just a junior employee who had grown used to following rules without questioning them. Yet something about the way the man had spoken, the quiet dignity in his voice, the careful way he had explained his situation without begging, without anger, stayed with her. She thought about her own brother, who had struggled after losing his job, and how easy it was to fall through the cracks when no one wanted to look too closely. Emily hesitated, torn between the weight of rules and the pull of her conscience. The right thing and the easy thing were rarely the same. She wiped her hands nervously on her skirt, straightened her badge, and made a decision that would ripple outward far beyond anything she could have predicted. She walked to her manager's office, knocked softly and asked if she could take her break early. The manager barely looked up, nodding distractedly as he scrolled through emails. With her heart pounding against her ribs, Emily grabbed her coat and stepped out into the misty afternoon. She approached the bench slowly, unsure of what to say, her throat dry with nerves. Mark looked up as she neared, his face cautious but not closed. "Hi," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain. I saw you come in earlier." Mark nodded, shifting slightly to make space on the bench, though. He said nothing. He was used to polite curiosity that went nowhere. "I know we couldn't open an account for you," Emily continued, sitting down beside him, her hands twisting together in her lap. "But maybe there's something else I can do to help." Mark studied her carefully. She was young, maybe mid-20s. Her brown hair pulled back into a tight braid, her face open and earnest in a way that reminded him painfully of how rare true kindness had become. He felt a flicker of something warm deep inside him, something dangerously close to hope. "Like what?" he asked softly. Emily shrugged, looking down at her hands. "I don't know," she admitted. "But You shouldn't have to do it all alone. Maybe we can figure it out together." The simplicity of her offer cut through him more sharply than any amount of rejection had. He nodded slowly, unsure what he was agreeing to, only knowing that for the first time in days, someone had chosen to sit beside him instead of walking away. They talked quietly for a while, the rain pattering gently around them. Emily asked careful questions: where he was staying, what kind of work he was looking for, what he needed most urgently. Mark answered truthfully within the boundaries of his disguise, speaking not as a billionaire, but as a man trying to climb back onto his feet. Emily listened without interrupting, without offering easy solutions or empty promises. When their conversation ended, she handed him a small card with her name and a number written on it. "This is my work number," she said, blushing slightly. "If you find a place that needs a reference, maybe I can help." Mark took the card with hands that felt strangely unsteady. He tucked it into his jacket, nodding his thanks, words sticking in his throat. Emily stood, brushing the rain from her coat. "Good luck," she said simply. Then she smiled, a small, uncertain smile, and disappeared back into the flow of the city, leaving behind a tiny seed of something that felt suspiciously like faith. Mark sat for a long time after she left, the card burning a hole in his pocket. He thought about the simple courage it took to step outside of protocol, to see a person where others saw only a problem. He thought about how change never came all at once, but in small, stubborn acts of goodness, stitched together by ordinary people choosing to care. And he realized that maybe he had not come here to test the bank, or even to test society. Maybe, without fully knowing it, he had come here to test himself, to remember that real power was not in building empires or platforms, but in refusing to forget the humanity that made it all matter. As evening fell and the streetlights blinked awake, one by one, Mark stood and slung his backpack over his shoulder. He turned his collar up against the mist and walked slowly away from the bench, carrying with him the small, precious knowledge that the world was not as cold as it sometimes seemed. And somewhere deep inside, an idea began to form. An idea, bigger than anything he had imagined when he first sat on that bench. An idea that would not just test one bank, but would challenge an entire system. Because if one young woman could make a difference, then maybe, just maybe, so could he. The plan that grew from the streets the following days unfolded in slow, heavy layers of rain, wind, and uncertainty. Each morning, starting with Mark pulling his worn coat tighter around his body and stepping back into the city that had long ago stopped looking closely at the faces on its sidewalks. He wandered the streets, listening, watching, learning in a way he had never truly done before. It was different when you were not the man whose face flashed across news headlines, when you were just another figure tucked into a bus shelter or blending into the back corner of a crowded soup kitchen. Invisible, ignored, forgotten, he saw how the system worked for some and failed so many others, how doors were opened for those who already had keys, and how those without them were left standing outside in the cold, their knuckles raw from knocking on doors that would never swing wide. He watched men and women apply for jobs they would never get because they lacked an address, a suit, a clean slate. He watched exhausted mothers beg for extensions on loans, only to be met with polite apologies and blank stares. He watched people try to climb out of their struggles with bleeding hands, only to be told they had not tried hard enough. And all the while, Emily's small card stayed safe in the pocket of his jacket, a quiet reminder that somewhere inside the cold machinery of rules and policies, there were still human hearts beating, still hands willing to reach out, even when it was risky, even when it was uncomfortable. One evening, as the city lights flickered uncertainly through a heavy mist, Mark found himself sitting on the back steps of an old community center, his backpack slumped at his feet, his mind racing. He had come to the streets thinking he would learn about others, but he had ended up learning just as much about himself. He thought about the towering offices he owned, the endless meetings about innovation and disruption, the billions of dollars shuffled around by people who talked about changing the world, but sometimes forgot about the people still waiting to be seen. And somewhere deep inside, something began to shift. Mark realized he could not just walk away from this. He could not slip back into his life of comfort and convenience, congratulating himself for having taken a brief journey through hardship. No, if he was serious, truly serious, about building a better world, then he had to do more than understand the problem. He had to help fix it. He thought about the people he had met, the tired woman who worked 2 jobs but still slept in a shelter, the teenage boy who dreamed of college but could not even get a checking account, the elderly veteran who had lost everything because a single piece of paper went missing. Their faces filled his mind, each one carrying a story that deserved more than just sympathy. It deserved action. That night, under the dim light of a cracked street lamp, Mark began to sketch out a plan on a crumpled piece of paper pulled from his backpack. Not a plan to build another app or another social network, but something far simpler and infinitely harder. A plan to create a new kind of system, a network of banks, shelters, employers, and volunteers, all working together, to catch the people who fell through the cracks before they hit the ground. A system where identification could be built through community records, where temporary addresses could be created for job applications, where small loans and banking services could be made accessible based on trust and participation, not just paperwork. He wrote until his fingers went numb, mapping out connections, thinking through barriers, dreaming bigger and harder than he had in years. And as he wrote, he realized he could not do it alone. He would need allies. He would need people like Emily, people who already knew that kindness was not weakness, but strength. He would need people willing to bend the rules in service of something greater: dignity, opportunity, hope. As dawn crept over the city, painting the worn bricks and tired sidewalks in pale gold, Mark folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his jacket. He stood, his legs stiff from the long night, his body aching in ways he was no longer used to. But his heart, for the first time in a long time, felt strong, determined, alive. He knew he had to return to the bank, not as a customer begging for help, not even as the hidden billionaire testing their humanity. He had to return as a messenger, carrying an idea too important to keep hidden. He would start with Emily. She had been the first to see him not as a burden, but as a man worth believing in. And together, maybe they could plant a seed that would grow into something powerful enough to crack open even the hardest doors. But Mark also knew the risks. He knew that revealing who he truly was might destroy the fragile trust that had begun to build. He knew that people might see his offer not as hope, but as mockery. And he knew that if he failed, it would not just be his own pride at stake. It would be the dreams of everyone he had met along the way, everyone who had trusted him without ever knowing his name. Still, he could not turn back now. Because when you have seen the truth of the world with your own eyes, you cannot pretend you are blind. You either become part of the problem or you fight to become part of the solution. And Mark Zuckerberg, dressed in a battered coat and worn shoes with dirt still under his fingernails, chose to fight. He chose to believe that sometimes one act of kindness could start a revolution. The truth behind the disguise: the next morning, the city felt different somehow, though it was still wrapped in the same soft mist and restless footsteps. Mark walked through the streets with a slow, steady purpose, the crumpled paper with his plan pressed tightly against his chest inside his jacket. He felt the weight of what he was about to do settle deep into his bones, heavier than any business, deal, or public speech he had ever given. This was not about building a company or launching a product. It was about rebuilding trust, not just from the people around him, but from a part of himself he feared had been lost along the way. He had spent so long building things for millions of users, millions of voices, shouting through the internet's endless tunnels, that he had forgotten the simple, terrifying intimacy of standing before one person and asking them to believe in you without a mask. As he reached the familiar corner where the small neighborhood bank stood tucked between two aging brick buildings, Mark slowed his steps. His hands trembled slightly, hidden deep inside his coat pockets, but he made no move to steady them. He wanted to feel this fear, to remember that real change always started with the decision to step into the unknown despite the risks. He pulled, opened the heavy glass door, stepping into the warm, humming air of the bank's small lobby. Emily was there, seated at her station behind the counter, typing quietly into her computer. Her brown hair was braided neatly back again, her expression focused, serious, and somehow more tired than Mark remembered. The sight of her steadied him. Here was someone who had chosen, without knowing anything about him, to offer kindness when it was easier to turn away. He waited until there were no customers in front of her, then approached the counter slowly. At first, she did not recognize him. It took a few seconds for her eyes to widen slightly in surprise, and even then, she masked it quickly with a professional smile. "Hello again," she said warmly, though he could hear a note of caution underneath. Mark nodded, lowering his voice. "Could we talk privately?" Emily hesitated, glancing at her manager's office door. But then she saw something in Mark's eyes, something that made her stand up, grab a small notepad, and gesture toward one of the private meeting rooms near the back. They entered the small room, the door clicking shut behind them, muffling the quiet hum of the bank outside. For a moment, they just stood there, the silence thick between them. Then Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out the crumpled paper, smoothing it carefully on the small table between them. "I lied to you," he said softly, not looking up. "Not about needing help, not about wanting to build something better, but about who I am." Emily said nothing, her face unreadable. Mark took a breath, the kind you take before stepping off a ledge, and continued, "My name is Mark Zuckerberg." He waited for disbelief, for anger, for betrayal. Instead, there was only a long, deep quiet, the kind that comes when someone is trying very hard to move past the surface of things and find the truth underneath. Emily studied him carefully, her eyes searching his face, his posture, his voice. She saw the dirt still smudged into the lines of his hands, the weariness in his shoulders, the sincerity in his trembling words. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice low. Mark explained everything. He told her about the loneliness he had seen from the bench, about the invisible walls that had kept people locked out of opportunity, about the need to remember that building. Systems meant nothing if you forgot the people who needed them most. He told her about the plan he had written in the dark hours of the night, a network built not on credit scores and perfect records, but on trust, community, and resilience. He spoke not as a billionaire selling an idea, but as a man who had finally realized he had spent too long speaking to crowds and not long enough listening to the quiet voices that slipped through the cracks. When he finished, Emily sat back in her chair, her arms crossed loosely across her chest, her expression thoughtful. "You want me to help you?" she asked. Mark nodded. "You want me to risk my job to help you build something that everyone else has already decided is too messy, too complicated, too human?" Mark nodded again, his throat tight. Emily smiled then, a slow, small smile filled with something fierce and beautiful. "Good," she said, "because if you were looking for easy, you came to the wrong place." For the first time in days, Mark felt a laugh bubble up inside him, a real laugh, the kind that shakes something loose in your chest. He grinned at her, feeling hope begin to uncoil from where it had been huddled deep inside. They spent the next hour hunched over the table, adding to the crumpled paper, sketching out ideas, building something raw and imperfect and impossibly beautiful out of nothing but faith and determination. Emily brought insights from her time inside the banking system, pointing out where changes could be made, where loopholes could be turned into lifelines. Mark listened, took notes, adjusted. For the first time in years, he was not the one leading the meeting. He was part of something equal, vulnerable, human. Outside, the rain continued to fall in soft, steady sheets, washing the city clean. Inside the small room, two people who had started as strangers worked side by side, weaving a plan that could change lives. But neither of them knew that outside the glass walls of the bank, forces were already moving. Forces that would not welcome their idea with open arms. Forces that would test everything they believed about kindness, courage, and the cost of trying to make a broken world a little more whole. When the world pushes back, the days that followed were unlike anything Mark had ever experienced. Not because he had not faced opposition before, he had faced lawsuits, critics, governments, but because this time the resistance was quieter, colder, hidden beneath polite smiles and perfectly worded emails. It began inside the bank itself. Small things at first. Emily was called into long meetings with her managers where they praised her work on the surface but hinted, in that careful way that powerful people have, that she was becoming too distracted, too emotional. They reminded her that banks were built on trust in systems, not on trust in broken people. They warned her that rules were there for a reason, that bending them, even for good intentions, could lead to chaos. Mark watched from the outside, unable to reveal his full hand yet. He saw how Emily returned from those meetings a little quieter, a little more guarded, but never once did she back away from him or from the plan they were building. Instead, she met each new obstacle with a stubborn kind of fire, the kind that comes from knowing you are doing the right thing even when the world calls you foolish. Together, they worked late into the nights in small cafes and public libraries, sketching out partnerships with shelters, job centers, and even small local businesses willing to give people chances without demanding spotless histories. But as their vision grew, so did the resistance. Larger forces began to notice. Local banking executives caught wind of the project through whispers and second-hand reports. They did not see it as an act of compassion. They saw it as a threat, a risk to their systems, a risk to their careful balance of profit and predictability. They began to put pressure on the bank's leadership, and that pressure trickled down through every layer until it landed squarely on Emily's desk. One rainy afternoon, as she was closing up her station, she was called once again into her manager's office. This time the conversation was not polite. They accused her of overstepping, of risking the bank's reputation, of dragging their name into something they wanted no part of. They did not raise their voices. They did not slam fists on desks, but they made their position brutally clear. If Emily did not distance herself from the project, if she did not return to the safe, clean, detached role they expected of her, she would be terminated. Emily walked out of that meeting with her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She found Mark waiting on the street outside, sheltered under the awning of a small coffee stand. The moment she saw him, all the anger and fear that had been building inside her came spilling out in words sharp and hot with frustration. She told him about the threats, the warnings, the way her dreams of helping people were now being twisted into accusations of recklessness. Mark listened quietly, the rain dripping steadily from the edge of the awning, soaking the cracked sidewalk. Between them, he could see the pain in her eyes, the deep, gut-wrenching struggle between the life she had worked so hard to build and the better world she wanted so desperately to believe in. "You can walk away," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "No one would blame you. You did more than most people ever would. You do not have to lose everything for this." Emily stared at him for a long time, her hands trembling slightly, her mind racing. She thought about her student loans, about the fragile career she had fought to carve out in a world that never made it easy for women like her. She thought about the small apartment she shared with her sister, the late nights she had spent studying, the silent, exhausting battles she had fought to be taken seriously. But then she thought about the man she had met on a rainy bench, the man the world had refused to see until she chose to. She thought about the battered hands that had built a plan, not from ambition, but from the raw, aching need to make something better. She thought about the faces she had passed every day on her way to work, the faces she had learned to look away from because it hurt too much to look too closely. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the cold rain slip down the back of her neck. She stepped closer to Mark, her chin lifted, her eyes clear. "If I walk away," she said, her voice shaking but strong, "then I become one of them. And I cannot do that. Not anymore." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Mark reached into his backpack and pulled out a thin folder, slightly crumpled but still clean inside. It was the first real proposal for their project, printed carefully, each page a step toward a system built not on exclusion, but on hope. He handed it to Emily without a word. She took it, her fingers steady now, and tucked it under her arm like a shield. They would need to move fast. They would need to find partners who believed before the system found new ways to crush them. But for the first time since Mark had stepped onto the streets wearing a mask of anonymity, he felt something stronger than uncertainty. He felt a real, burning belief that they could win, not because they had money or power on their side, but because they had something the system had forgotten how to fight against. They had the stubborn, unbreakable belief that people were worth saving. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. The day they proved the world wrong. The morning of the launch was cold and sharp, the sky the color of old tin, the streets glistening from a rain that had stopped just hours earlier. Mark stood by the edge of the small community center they had managed to rent with the help of a few brave partners, clutching a stack of freshly printed flyers in his gloved hands. He watched as volunteers, people who had once stood on the other side of locked doors and closed offices, set up battered tables and hung simple signs with hand-painted letters. No grand banners, no flashing lights, just a message written in plain, strong words. Everyone deserves a second chance. Emily arrived just as the sun broke through the heavy clouds, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee and wearing a wide smile that barely hid the nerves dancing beneath it. She handed him a cup, their fingers brushing briefly, a small exchange of warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. They stood together for a moment, letting the rising hum of life around them fill the silence. And Mark realized with a kind of wonder that what they had built was no longer just a dream trapped inside crumpled pieces of paper. It was real. It was breathing. The idea had been simple but revolutionary. A small bank, staffed by volunteers and supported by donations and local grants, offering no-fee accounts to anyone willing to participate in the community program. A system built on trust, education, and personal growth, rather than strict bureaucracy and credit checks. They had created pathways for people to earn basic identifications through community references, offering financial literacy classes and job placement workshops in exchange for mentorship hours given back to others. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was alive, and today they were opening the doors for the first time. The first to arrive were hesitant, their faces tight with the kind of cautious hope that comes from a lifetime of being promised help only. To find it comes with chains. Mark greeted each one personally, his worn jacket and tired eyes putting them at ease in a way no polished suit ever could. Emily moved through the crowd, her voice warm and steady, explaining the process, answering questions, reminding people over and over again that here their worth was not measured by what they had lost, but by what they still carried inside them. By midday, the line stretched down the block. Not just people in desperate need, but curious passers-by, local business owners, even a few officials who had caught wind of the project and come to see for themselves what was happening. Mark watched them all, feeling an emotion swell inside him, so big, so overwhelming, that it threatened to break him open. It was not pride. It was something deeper. It was the simple, profound joy of witnessing the moment when people who had been invisible to the world finally realized they were being seen. Of course, not everyone was happy. Representatives from larger banks hovered at the edges, their suits crisp, their smiles thin and brittle. They asked careful questions, took notes, made veiled comments about legality and risk. But for the first time, Mark did not feel the old urge to retreat or smooth things over. He knew now that real change did not come without making powerful people uncomfortable. It was a price he was willing to pay. As the afternoon faded into a soft, golden evening, Emily called Mark over to a small table where an older man was sitting, holding a freshly opened bank book in his calloused hands like it was a treasure. He looked up at Mark with eyes that shone wetly under the dim lights. "I never thought," he said, his voice breaking, "that anyone would give me another chance." Mark sat down heavily across from him, the weight of all the days and nights that had led to this moment settling into his chest. He reached across the table and shook the man's hand firmly, feeling the rough strength of a life spent surviving. "You never needed our permission," Mark said softly. "You always deserved it." Emily smiled beside him, and in that simple, quiet moment, surrounded by battered tables and chipped coffee cups, Mark realized that this, not the billions, not the titles, this was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. He had not changed the whole world, not yet, but he had changed something for the people sitting around him. And sometimes that was where real revolutions began, not in boardrooms, but on broken sidewalks, between two people daring to believe in each other again. As night fell and the small bank closed its doors for the first time, Mark and Emily stood side by side under the flickering streetlight. Neither spoke for a long time. They did not need to. Finally, Mark turned to her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ready to do it all again tomorrow?" he asked. Emily laughed, a sound bright and tired and full of hope. "Only if you're buying the coffee," she said. And so they walked together into the deepening night, two ordinary people armed with nothing more than stubborn hearts and a belief that kindness, once set loose in the world, could never be silenced again.